Okay, so it's been a week since we were here. So let's pick up where we were then. Remember, what we've just done is we've just examined those broad contexts that transformed American society and that really necessitated the rise or the invention of something called advertising. We looked at those broad structures. We looked at issues around economics and economic transformation. We looked at business strategy, and we looked at social factors to do with the crisis in the realm of production that advertising also helped to solve. So today, we're going to look at, we're going to trace through the particular industry that arose to perform those functions. So last time was, okay, here is why advertising is needed. And what we're going to look at today is the way in which an industry arose to fulfill those functions. And in particular, what I want to look at is the relationship between, and for the rest of the semester, if you want to understand advertising, you've got to understand this relationship. It's a central relationship to understand advertising. That is the relationship between clients, manufacturers on the one hand, businesses on the one hand, the media on the other hand, whatever that media may be, and then the advertising industry, which brings business and media together. That is, you cannot understand anything about advertising unless you understand how it is connected, the function that it performs between business and media. And that's what we're going to look at how that develops. And ultimately, what I want to be able to do, next time what we'll look at we'll actually look at some ads. We're not going to look at very many ads today because I think before we can look at ads, which is what I want to explain, right? What I want you to be able to do when you get to the end of the semester is to be able to look at an ad and to be able to say something about it. To be able to say something that you wouldn't be able to say at the start of the semester. To be able to say something about why the forms you see in it may have developed, when they developed, why they developed as they did, what possible effect could it have, why this message as opposed to another message. I want you to be able to say something intelligent about that is not just obvious, that is not just obvious from the content. And to do that means we've got to be able to have some context for why ads look like they do. So I am interested in the content of ads, because that is, when we started off the semester saying that's what surrounds us, those are the stories that surround us. But to understand them, we've got to take one step back. We've got to kind of peel away the outer layers of the onion to get to the core of it. And especially, we have to be able to explain, and this actually is true, not just of advertising, but of almost anything you look at. You have to be able to explain changes. Why do things change? And when you talk about changes, why does advertising change? Why does it start off in one way and end up another way? We've got to be able to explain that dynamic, because again, there is nothing inevitable about it. It is those changes don't fall from heaven fully formed. They are the result of particular kinds of pressures, social, cultural, economic pressures. So we have to be able to explain changes, why things change. Now remember, and again, I keep coming back to this. Remember, this is the way advertising develops, for example, in North America. We're looking at a process that is constructed. There is almost nothing natural in the world. Perhaps the weather, but we actually now know that human beings actually can change the weather as well. So there's very little that's natural in the world. The world we live in is constructed, and we have to figure out how it's constructed. For example, in Europe, advertising develops very differently. It actually developed as a very different institution. Because for a long time, unlike the United States, advertising in Europe is limited to just print. Whereas, as we'll see later on today, in America, we go from, there's newspapers and magazines, and then radio is introduced, then television is introduced really quickly. In Europe, for a long time, in fact, radio and television are kind of kept out of the advertising mix. And as a result, because there are very few radio ads, there are very few television ads, as a result, advertising actually develops very, very differently. In fact, right up until the present time, in some places in Europe, or some channels in Europe, the advertising is limited to one part of the evening. So it doesn't even appear between the programs. Sometimes it appears as one part, as one chunk sometime in the evening. If that's the context within which advertising is supposed to work, though, it changes the nature of the industry. So the social and economic, so there is nothing natural about it. There's nothing natural about it. To understand why things change, to understand, I would argue, to understand any kind of historical change requires you to do actually very specific kinds of analysis. Not broad analysis where it's the same all over the world, but actually very specific analysis in very, very specific context. Now, the social and economic movements that we examined last time took place between 1850 and 1920, somewhere around there. And in fact, and what we're going to look at today, I want to really, in the first part, concentrate on that period between 1850 and 1920. Because in fact, by 1920, the broad framework of the advertising industry, in terms of the relationship with industry and media, is pretty well established. It hasn't really fundamentally changed since then. There have been other important changes, of course. But essentially, the advertising industry, if we looked at the advertising industry in 1920 or so, the large agencies, we would recognize them we recognize them as modern agencies. And we'll look to see how things have changed as well. Now, so in this period, in the early period from 1850 to about 1920, we can in fact identify three different stages. Okay, three different stages in the development of advertising. I want to go through these stages one at a time. The first stage is what we can call the stage of advertising as what they called it as a space jobber, from around the 1850s to the 1890s. Now we've seen. Okay, let me explain what this means. We've seen how industrial expansion led to the production of the immense collection of commodities, okay, things that have to be sold. And we saw again the need for manufacturers to expand their markets nationally. That manufacturers have to start thinking about themselves not just as regional producers and sellers, but as national producers and sellers. How do you reach into other geographical areas? In fact, for example, these are rough figures I'm going to give you, but by 1890, for example, there are 4,000 manufacturers in the country who would like to advertise nationally. That is, who wanted to advertise in places other than where they are based. They want to expand to other markets. At the same time, so on the one hand, there is, from the side of business, there is a tremendous need manufacturers need to figure out how to get their product and word of their product out to beyond just where they're based. At the same time, there is a huge increase in the number of newspapers that you could place advertising in. In 1900, for example, there are over 2,200 daily newspapers. By 1909, there are over 13,000 weekly newspapers, all willing to take advertising. So we have the situation where actually manufacturers, business, they need to expand, and then you've got all these media, all these newspapers, and in the end of this period, magazines as well that have sprung up. And the question is, how do you put the two together? In fact, right at this stage, there is a great deal of what we call confusion in the marketplace. There simply isn't enough information, in fact, for the marketplace to function the way it needs to function. Manufacturers, who are potential advertisers, and newspapers, who are places where advertising could be carried, don't have enough information about each other. For example, manufacturers don't know. Let's start. We'll draw a little diagram. On the one hand, manufacturers, they don't know which newspapers or magazines to best place their ads in. Right. So information simply doesn't exist. These newspapers exist in other towns, in other cities, etc., in other regions, and manufacturers don't have any direct experience of them, don't have enough information. So manufacturers, in fact, don't know where to advertise. At the same time, you have media, newspapers, who don't really know much about manufacturers, because you've got this, someone from another city who wants to place an ad in what do you know about them? Are they reputable? Will they pay their bills, etc.? And so at this time, there is, as I said, a great deal of confusion. Manufacturers don't, no one has enough information. And so what's required at this time, in fact, is a third party to bring the needs of manufacturers or business and media together. And that is the advertising agents. That's for the first agents, in fact, the first businesses that we would think of as advertising agents. All they did, okay, the first agents, they did not create ads. All that the first agents did was simply bring business and media together. They actually helped to place ads. They helped to place ads. So they would actually put media and business together. They would say, you know, they would be hired by a business, and they would offer their expertise to say, okay, here is where you can place your ad. Here is a newspaper in which you can buy, you know, this many columns of space to put your ad. At the same time, they will be able to, once they develop their relationships with media, they could also then, you know, the media could then rely upon the agents actually to make sure the bills were paid. So there needed to be a third party to bring the needs of business and media together when there wasn't enough information. Now what happened was they went from, so that was the first stage. That was essentially bringing people together. And the agents, the advertising agents, they got their money from the media. In fact, to start off with, they were clients actually of the media, because the media would give them 25% as a commission for whatever advertising they bought to the media. The commission system actually survives through to the present day. So again, what started off as, and it's not 25% anymore, but there is still that commission system, where advertising, and that's actually when that's how advertising agencies measure their accounts. When they talk about, you know, when someone has just landed, to the present day, you know, J. Walter Thompson has landed a $50 million account with Pepsi. What they're talking about, that is how much Pepsi wants to spend on buying media, on buying time in newspapers, in television, etc. And J. Walter Thompson will get, whatever advertising agency, will get a percentage of that as their commission. And so that's why agencies want to go, you want to attract the largest businesses you can with the largest advertising budgets, because your income is dependent upon how much they're going to spend on advertising. And we'll see the development of that in the next couple of classes. And they soon progressed from that. They went from this simple placing function to pretty soon they were actually, the agents actually started to buy space from the media themselves and then sell it on to businesses. So they went from simply placing to becoming brokers. Just got a quote, the handout you'll need from today, I hope you bought it. You printed it up. It's the one that's called the Historical Development of the Advertising Industry. Quote number 1, this is from a book called Social Communication Advertising by William Lease et al. They say, talking about the situation, the increased number of newspapers was making the task of placing ads unaided too complex for the would-be advertiser. It was also changing the position of the agents. Newspapers lost interest in exclusive contracts with agents. In response, agents became independent brokers standing between the publishers and the advertisers who bargained with the agents for the best deal on advertising space. Because that's in the first stage, first 30, 40 years of the industry, all advertising agents do is broker space in some way. They direct businesses to media. They actually buy space in media and then sell it on to businesses. But that is all that first stage is involved in. All they are doing is placing ads. Nothing yet to do with writing ads. And that, as I said, was very broadly the function of advertising agencies into the 1890s or so. And then the situation begins to change. It begins to change for a number of reasons. Firstly, that is, so this is what we have to figure out. If there are these different stages in how advertising develops, that is, at the start they were simply selling space and placing and dealing with and brokering space, but they moved from that to something else. Why did that take place? That is the historical question that I think we always have to pose. The answer to this is quite simple. Both sides of, let me go back actually for a second. Okay, both sides of that relationship that advertising is mediating are starting, in fact, to question exactly what advertising agents are doing. Manufacturers, for example, are not sure about the value they receive from the agencies. For example, because of the commission system, the agents would receive more if they directed them to media that charge more. And so they weren't really sure about to what extent they were getting really good value for money. Were they getting the best buy they could do, or were they being driven to a media that was profitable for the agents, but not particularly for the manufacturers? So manufacturers started to wonder about the role of the agents. At the same time, the publishers, the media, were also starting to be a little bit unhappy with the commissions they were paying to agents. They were paying agents 25%. That's 25% of their profits. That's 25% of their income. Sorry, 25% of their income that is going away. And again, they're not sure to what extent that the agents are worth that 25%. Now remember, and also remember, after the industry, or after the marketplace has been operating in this function for a little while, both businesses and media start to learn about each other. At the start, the agents arose as a need because of the need to provide information. And yet, in fact, by their own activities in the first 30, 40 years, by their own activities, they in fact had done a lot to rationalize the marketplace. They had done a lot to rationalize the marketplace. They provided directories of media to show clients what were the different circulation rates and what were the best buys. At the same time, so businesses actually could start getting information about media from what existed. At the same time, as far as media were concerned, manufacturers have now been around for enough time. They had their own reputation. Didn't have to worry about if this was some disreputable company, doing something illegal, or whether they were going to pay their bills. Now, some of these corporations have been around for a while, and so you knew what their reputation was. And so, in fact, these things actually put pressure on the role of the agency as a space broker. In fact, because of their own, in one sense, they were in danger of becoming extinct because of the good job that they had done themselves. So to survive, the agencies had to look to other functions they could offer in the marketplace. Okay, if space selling by itself wasn't enough, was there something else that the marketplace needed that they could offer? And in fact, what they started to do was respond to the needs of manufacturers. The needs of business actually started to change around about the 1890s as well. And so, and agencies start to respond to that. They start to add, this is the second stage now, let me just go back. The second stage in the development of advertising is where they add copywriting. Okay, copywriting and creative services. So now, what they're offering is not just we'll place your ad, we'll direct you to the media, but we will actually help to write the ad. In fact, before the 1890s, manufacturers had done most of their own, they'd done their own ads, and in fact, they were mostly just statements of fact about products. They weren't particularly elaborate. They were simply like, here's the product, here's what it does, etc. And it wasn't particularly a persuasive message. However, as we know from the analysis we've done, at the turn of the century, the needs of manufacturers start to change. Firstly, of course, there is what we looked at already, which is the branding of products. Branding becomes more widespread. Remember now, as branding develops, also persuasion develops as well. It's now not just giving information about products, it's about, okay, why you should buy this product and what this product actually means. So the ads have to be, the advertising has to change, or there is a need for a new kind of advertising. At the same time, there are new technologies of printing. Now it's no longer just newspapers. As magazines develop and as different printing develops, you can now have bigger ads, you can have illustrations, you can have color, you can have photography. And so the potential of the media form also expands. And this is now the context within which manufacturing, what do manufacturers know? What do businesses know about communication? Right? Nothing. If you make shoes, you're an expert in shoes. Are you an expert in making messages about shoes? No. So manufacturers, in fact, started to need started to need copyright and creative skills. And the agencies, recognizing this, actually started to offer these as well. So that by 1900, around about the turn of the century, most of the large agencies are not only helping to direct, bringing media and businesses together, but they are also now starting, in fact, to offer their creative services. They're also actually writing the ads that they're now helping to place. And that actually, I think you could say, is one of the major changes in the authorship of what appears in American culture. And the ad agents, what they offer are specialized skills. Remember, if the agencies didn't offer something, they wouldn't exist. And what they offer is a particular kind of expertise that doesn't exist anywhere else. So the expertise they offer that manufacturers don't have and even the media don't have is this expertise they offer is the ability to create messages that will help to sell products. And media can't do that. Media are experts in editorial matters. They're experts in producing stories at this time. Manufacturers are experts in the products. And what both manufacturers need and the economy needs at this time, in fact, is persuasive messages. And especially as branding becomes more important, and especially as new technologies of communication become more important. So as I said, by 1900, most of the large agencies are offering these expanded creative services. However, pretty soon, manufacturers actually start realizing that they need more than just clever copy and illustrations to sell their products. They actually need, as the marketplace is getting more complex, they actually also need market research. And they start to recognize that advertising campaigns have to be integrated into a coherent and appropriate marketing campaign. So it's not just clever ads anymore. It's now actually you need marketing services. You need information about the consumer. Who is the consumer? How do they buy? What do they buy? What media do they listen to? What media do they consume, etc. So that by 1920, in fact, most of the large agencies were making marketing campaigns, but they were collecting other information in the marketplace for their clients as well. So in that short period of time, said from around 1850 to 1920, and that's those 70 years, we can see those three distinct stages. Advertising, but by the 1920s, in fact, the ad agency placed the advertising, wrote the advertising, and conducted other market research for the client to make the advertising as effective as it could be. Okay. Space jobber, creative, market research. And these are additive skills. These are things that are added. They're not distinct stages where they stop selling space and only do creative. These are things that the advertising agency takes on. And again, we're going to talk a lot, as we talk historically in the next couple of classes, we're going to talk a lot about stages. And what I want you to think about when I talk about stages is not that something happens and it stops and then something else happens. When we're talking about advertising and media, we're talking about how things are added on. So in fact, the situation becomes more and more complex. It becomes more and more complicated as advertising takes on more and more functions. And within that, we can say, well, here is when this starts. Here is when something else starts. Here is where the industry starts to think differently about consumers. And you can actually see it reflected in ads, as I hope we'll see next time. But remember, it is not, okay, they stop then thinking about consumers in some other way. Advertising is never, nothing works like that, where it becomes cumulative rather than sequential in that way. So let's go to quote number 2. This is a kind of summing up of this. This is from an author called Daniel Pope. And he says, summing this up, he says, yet for all their limitations, advertising agents had accomplished much in the years from, he says, 1890 to 1920. They had, in effect, created a new product. Formerly, agents with access to space in newspapers and magazines had sold that space. That was number one. Now they sold something else, their access to American consumers. To use a chilling but revealing phrase of modern marketing, advertising agencies dared to offer their corporate clients a share of the American mind. Okay, share of the American mind. Now, so around, as I said, round about 1920, the basic structure of the industry had been pretty much established. And I said it changes, some things change along the way, but I said if we were to cut into history in 1920, we would recognize that industry as something that is connected to our modern advertising agents. However, remember what I want to do, and this is, I want you to be able to, as I said, to look at an ad, because that again is what that's ultimately what we're interested in. The reason there's a whole class on this is because of the spread of this commercial story, the spread of this commercial discourse everywhere. And so we've got to be able to look at it and to be able to say, okay, where did it come from? What influences are there that we can see in here? When did this start? When did advertising start to think in this way? Now, to understand that, we have to understand this, as advertising stands between media and business, as it stands between them, it's not passive. It's a bridge. In fact, it bridges the needs of business with the needs of media. But it is not a passive bridge. It's not just that it doesn't do anything. In fact, what happens on the bridge itself, what happens within the industry itself, is hugely important. That is, the agencies add value to this relationship. The agencies, in fact, add things to that relationship. They don't simply, as it were, kind of reflect passively the needs on either side. They also have their own interests as well, the central part of which is they are businesses that need to make money. And they are businesses that need to do their job as well as they can do it. Now, and so we have to look within the industry. What is happening within the industry itself? And especially, how do they change how they think about, especially, the audience? What are the different ways of thinking about the audience? Because remember, whenever you're speaking, whenever you're communicating, your communication is connected directly to the person you're communicating to, or the entity you're communicating to, and you take that into account. Okay? For one thing, if you know the person doesn't speak English, it doesn't make much sense to speak in English. Therefore, communication is always connected to both what the speaker wants, what the person who makes the communication wants, but also to what they think about the audience. What is their conception of the person who is, or the entity that is listening to this message. And the communication will be shaped by what you think of the audience. The communication will be shaped by your understanding. Your understanding may be totally wrong, right? You're talking to someone and you think they speak English and they don't, and you speak in English, right? It doesn't mean your communication is wrong. It just means it's ineffective. And hopefully, as soon as you find out, you would make some changes. Okay, if I'm really interested in communicating and this is the condition of this audience, what do I have to do now to get my message over? So the way in which you think about the audience, in fact, is very, very important. And in terms of the industry, we can actually see how they change how they think advertising works. Actually, I'll say that again. We can see how they change how they think audiences work and how consumers work. And that changes then the advertising. The first stage in the development of advertising, and this is based on a study that was done by someone who looked at the major journal of the industry called Printers Inc. at that time, and to see how they thought about the audience. The very first stage is what we can call the stage of rationality, in which you think the audience is the rationalist stage, in which you think the audience they're rational. And therefore, if you think they're rational, then the advertising is going to be about, actually, we're going to have to use rational arguments. We're going to have to give information. We're going to have to inform people about goods, about the objective character of goods, about where they come from and how they were made and how well they do their job, etc. And we've got to give people a reason to buy the product. That is, if they're rational, they're not just going to spend their money without some thinking through of the argument. And so if you look at the early stage of advertising, in fact, it's full of these what seem to be very rationalistic modes of argumentation. in which you're trying to convince people in a rational way. And therefore, it's also, of course, connected to early on. It's also connected to the fact that, well, you only have newspapers to deal with, and the major thing, the major form of communication at that point is text. And so there is a lot of writing because that is what the medium also encourages as well. So we've got to be able to actually look at the needs of media. Sorry, you've got to look at the media that is available to you. You've got to look at the audience and, well, what do you think about the audience? And then you've got to say, okay, well, how is this, and what are the needs of manufacturers? What are the needs of business? And advertising agents have to mediate that relationship. Advertising agents are always, they talk about themselves. They say, we're the filling in the middle of the sandwich. The media and the business, they're the bread of the bread, and we're in the middle, kind of mediating what their needs are. That notion of rationality doesn't change because, in fact, some products, right up until the present day, some product types and some audiences are thought to work through rationality. And so to rationality is added, around 1910, is added the notion of irrationality as well. And this is what we can go. We're going to be in this, these two classes, we're going to keep talking about these different stages of advertising. And essentially historically, there are four stages. We may be in a fifth stage now, and we'll look at that later on. But in terms of the historical work that there's been done, there are four different stages of advertising. And almost everything will keep coming back to these four different periods. The second period, as I said, is this notion of irrationality. By this time, okay, advertisers know a lot more about people. They've had experience of how people actually consume, and they realize that people are more than just rational. And also remember now, it's not just, there is a real need in the early part of the century to make sure that the immense accumulation of commodities is sold. And you've got to really move into high persuasion mode. And that's going to require also more than just rationality. And in this period, human nature comes to be viewed as basically irrational. And that is, you can appeal to people not just through their rational, not through the rational, but you can appeal to them also through non-rational impulses. You can appeal through the emotions. You can appeal through feelings. And so ads operate by suggestion. Illustrations and photography become much more important in this period as well. There's a lot more kind of attention-getting stimuli in advertising, a lot more visual tricks that are used. There is a play upon sympathy. There's a play upon the notion of the people actually are really worried about being in society. They're worried about what other people think about them as well. And so there's a great deal, as you'll see, there's a great deal of play upon the fear of public shame. The fear that someone is going to evaluate you and evaluate what you're doing, and they're going to reach some kind of negative conclusion about that. Or that, in fact, people like getting recognition. They like approval. So what can you do to, in fact, to play upon those feelings, those that appeal to emotion? The third stage, so to rationality is added this notion of irrationality. The third stage, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this now, is the stage of what's called motivational research, which lasts from about the 1930s into the 1950s. There are, in this period, there are new techniques, new research techniques that are introduced. It becomes much, much more scientific. There is lots of laboratory testing of people to find out what motivates them. It's kind of bringing the sciences, the social sciences, and the human sciences at the service of advertising. And motivational research? What is it that motivates people? What is the basis of behavior? Because if you can find out the basis of behavior, then you can use that information in how then you construct your ads. As I said, there's a lot of psychological testing. There's a focus on the consumer as an individual. That is, what is it that makes the person tick? And essentially, it's a kind of, if the second stage, the first stage was a focus on the product. Okay, here is what the product does. The second stage was recognizing that individuals are, in fact, part of society. And that, in fact, it's just as important to talk about not just what the product does, but what it means. In this third stage, there's a kind of turning inwards even more to the consumer. Can we get inside the consumer's head? Can we try, in fact, through laboratory testing, can we get inside the brain and actually figure out exactly what is going on with consumers? And can we pinpoint the basis? Can we pinpoint the basis of human behavior? Now, if you can, if you're an advertiser, you can, and you can pinpoint the basis on which the audience that you're appealing to operates, and you know that, you can figure that out, well, that gives you a tremendous advantage in terms of how then you construct your communication devices, how then you construct your ads. So there is a great deal of focus in this period of trying to find that out. So I've got a relatively long quote. Let's go to quote number 3. This actually is from, I showed you the cover of this book earlier on in the semester. This is the book about subliminal advertising, but he talks about the development of motivational research. He says, quote number 3, sorry, hold on. Okay, quote number 3 says, the advertising researchers employed psychological methods that had previously been used to diagnose and treat neuroses. They discovered that people often bought things for unconscious reasons they were not aware of. Okay, that's a little bit different than irrational. Now this is the movement inside. This is the movement into the unconscious. In a process known as depth probing, they ferreted out consumers' secret motivations about particular products by asking subjects to lie down and spontaneously disclose their innermost feelings. The researchers asked questions such as, quote, what is your earliest memory involving a cookie? Or how does eating a cookie make you feel? They also employed word association tests, cookies, mother, milk, sentence completion tests, when my mother gives me a cookie, I felt, and projective tests in which the subject was shown a picture and asked to make up a story about it. They utilized psychodramas in which subjects were asked to physically act out their feelings toward the product. Focus groups were used to probe several consumers at the same time. Let's say at the same time? Sure, sorry, there's a mistake. That should say at the same time, not as the same time. The sessions were often filmed and analyzed by teams of researchers. Okay, so the movement into the laboratory, the movement into the individual psyches of consumers, really trying to get at what it is that is the basis of behavior. The second part of the quote, this is the second part of quote 3, just again talking about this, it says, in addition to psychological tests, advertisers developed electronic equipment that measured consumers' unconscious physical reactions to products, packages, and advertising. The devices they created detected minuscule changes of sweat on the skin, tiny changes in heart and pulse rates, and minute muscular contractions that divulge the subject's unconscious emotional states. Okay, so people are hooked up to electrodes, and in their head they're shown stuff, and they see how the body responds. They see how the body responds to different kinds of stimuli. In some supermarkets, sophisticated hidden cameras were used to monitor the eye movements of shoppers. The dilation of the shoppers' pupils revealed how interested they were in each of the products. The number of times they blinked to reveal their degree of tension. And he says, many of the shoppers were found to be in mild hypnotic trances when they did this. Sometimes that's the only way you can get through shopping in a supermarket, is to be in some kind of trance. So this is, as I said, a movement kind of inwards, a movement towards the unconscious. Now I'm going to show you a little clip now from a video. This is a contemporary, again, this method and this research technique didn't go away. In fact, advertisers are still doing it. Actually, some people are making millions of dollars doing this stuff. I'm going to show you a clip now. It's about 9 minutes long from talking about one of these strategies from a film called The Persuaders, which was a film on PBS. It's an okay film. And I may use some other clips from it as well. This is a contemporary version. This is a contemporary version of motivational research.
There's a focus group, it's a really, really small group.
Far away from the boardrooms of the entertainment industry, in places like this nondescript office park outside Boston, the nitty-gritty work of selling starts with a simple questionnaire about bread.
And now what do you see as the disadvantages to eating grain-based foods?
Today, faced with a nation hooked on low-carb diets, The baked goods industry needs to find out just how Americans feel about their products.
I'm going to read you some different emotions. I've got a whole list of them here. For each one of them, I just want you to tell me yes or no as to whether or not you think you feel that emotion when you're eating white bread. Okay? The first one is accepting. People accepting when you're eating white bread.
Yeah, I would say yes, sir.
Affectionate.
No.
Lonely.
No.
Disappointed.
No.
Afraid.
No.
Trusting.
No, I don't think that would be an issue.
Would you feel uncertain?
Yeah, a little uncertain. I've got one question. Can I ask a question? The question was, when you eat bread, do you feel lonely? Have you found people say yes, they feel lonely when they're eating bread?
Not a lot on this one.
Welcome to the strange world of market research.
Now we have to be careful because that's not politically correct to say women and inside.
Where those who claim to have figured out the hidden desires of consumers are treated as gurus.
We all come from a woman. We all spend 9 months inside of a woman. So women are experts in the inside. Translation, when a woman buys a car, the first thing she is looking at is, do they have cup holders? You know,
Dr. Clotaire Rapaille lives in a baronial mansion in upstate New York.
Price-quality relationship.
Fortune 500 companies and their advertising agencies flock there
Levels of value.
to drink French champagne, admire Rapaille's many cars, and listen with rapt attention to his insights on the irrational mind of the American shopper.
And we have to understand for each product what is the dynamic behind that. What is it that people are really buying there? We still have people that buy things that they don't really need. Sometimes a product is not expensive enough.
What sets Rapaille apart from many other market researchers is his belief that consumers are driven by unconscious needs and impulses.
My experience is that most of the time, people have no idea why they're doing what they're doing. They have no idea. So they're going to try to make up something that makes sense. Why do you need a Hummer to go shopping? Well, you know, in case I need to go off-road. Well, you live in Manhattan. Well, you do need a four-wheel drive in Manhattan. Well, you know, sometimes I go out and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand that this is disconnected. This has nothing to do with what the real reason is for people to do what they do.
Rapaille began his career as a psychiatrist in Europe studying autism.
My training with autistic children is that I had to understand what these kids were trying to tell me with no words because they don't speak. Wow. So then that's part of my training. How can I decode this kind of behavior? Which is not a word.
Rapaille claims that there are unconscious associations for nearly every product we buy, buried deep in our brains.
One of my discoveries was that when you learn a word, whatever it is, coffee, love, mother, the first time you understand, you imprint the meaning of this word, you create a mental connection. And so actually every word has a mental highway. I call that a code, an unconscious code in the brain.
Corporations love the idea of buying a single key to the psyches of vast numbers of consumers, a simple code that lies behind millions of individual decisions. Rapaille gave up psychiatry and says he has never looked back.
I have 50 of the Fortune 100 company as clients.
Tonight, Rapaille has been invited to speak to the Luxury Marketing Council of America.
The premise of the council is to bring the smartest minds in marketing together and help us all figure out ways to get more money from customers with the most money.
Rapaille has been commissioned by a handful of big companies like Boeing and Acura to break the code on luxury.
We're just delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. I don't believe what people say. So some people listen to what they say and they say, do you want to buy that? You want to do this? I don't believe what people say. I want to understand why they do what they do. I found this word, and with that, I want to understand you guys. And this is the word. I hope I didn't make a mistake, but it's the right spelling.
To crack the code on luxury, Rapaille conducts a series of focus groups.
I'm serious. That's what I want to understand, how you feel about it. And anything for me is interesting.
Right.
Money.
He takes his subjects on what he hopes will be a three-stage psychic journey, past reason, through emotion, to the primal core, where Rapai insists all purchasing decisions really lie.
We start with the cortex, because people want to show how intelligent they are. So give them a chance. We don't care what they say.
When people try to sell you luxury things, what kind of word they use?
Well made. Well made. Nothing new there. And then we have a break. They're usually very happy with themselves. Oh, we did a good job and so on. When they come back, now we go into the emotion. And I tell them, you're going to tell me a little story, like if I was a 5-year-old from another planet.
Once upon a time.
So suddenly they are into a mindset that is completely different. They don't try to be logical or intelligent. They just try to please a 5-year-old from another planet.
I would say you and the entire family to Maui.
They don't understand what they're doing anymore. Good. That's what I want. At the end of the second hour, when we go to the break, they say, this guy is crazy. What is he doing? I thought I understood what we were doing. Now I don't understand anything. I mean, I get paid to do that? This is excellent. This is what I want.
Shows up a real reality show.
That's what it is. A reality show.
Right.
And there's 19 of us.
They're gonna give
you
you,
have our room.
they're going to give you $1 million. They want to see how you spend it.
Maybe that's
you waste it or not.
Then when they come back for the third hour, then there is no more chairs. Oh, what is going on here? How come no chairs? And I explained to them that I would like them to try to go back to the very first time that they experience what we're trying to understand.
Rapai is hunting for our primal urges. He's after what he calls the reptilian hot buttons that compel us to action.
It's absolutely crucial to understand what I call the reptilian hot button. My theory is very simple. The reptilian always win. I don't care what you're going to tell me intellectually. Give me the reptilian.
So I'm going to turn the lights off now, and we're going to all relax together.
I want you to be in a mindset a little bit like the one you have when you wake up in the morning. You'll be surprised to see that things come back to your mind that you forgot for the time for 20, 30 years. It's amazing.
The scribbles of consumers in the semi-darkness, half-remembered words and pictures associated with luxury, somehow become Rapai's key to unlocking the luxury code.
Once you get the code, suddenly everything starts making sense. I understand why this car sells, this car doesn't sell. You know, I understand why a small 29,000 Cadillac cannot sell. No, I understand why, because it's off code. Ooh.
Over the years, Rapai has told car makers to beef up the size of their SUVs and tint the windows, because the code for SUVs is domination. He told a French company trying to sell cheese to Americans that they were off code.
In France, the cheese is alive. You never put the cheese in the refrigerator because you don't put your cat in the refrigerator. It's the same, it's alive. If I know that in America the cheese is dead, and I've been studying cheese in almost 50 states in America, I can tell you the cheese is dead everywhere. Then I have to put that up front. I have to say this cheese is safe, is pasteurized, is wrapped up in plastic. I know the plastic is a body bag because you can put it in the fridge. I know the fridge is a morgue. That's where you put the dead bodies. Huh? And so once you know that, this is the way you market cheese in America.
It just got easier to just say cheese.
One word that kept coming up in the stories, and I think is a reaching to the next level.
While Clotaire Rapai and his clients continue their quest to crack the code on luxury,
it might be interesting to explore the difference between first class and world class.
That's just nice work if you can get it. Essentially, why would advertisers or companies pay $100,000 to listen to the musings of obviously a very intelligent French guy? But well, partly it's because they have no idea why people buy. It is, even though it's meant to be kind of scientific. Even though it's meant to be scientific, there is. This is kind of playing at science. It's playing at science, trying to make something scientific that is, in fact, that they have no idea for. And again, in one sense, it's an interesting. I mean, this is a modern version of this, but this is the research technique that started in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, 50s of motivational research, and it's really smart people asking really stupid questions. I mean, actually, Rapai is a good example. What was he working on? He was working with autistic kids. What's he doing now? He's trying to figure out what cheese means to Americans. Same guy, right? I mean, but he is now, instead of working with autistic kids and he is now putting that incredible intellect that he obviously has at the behest of people who are willing to pay him ridiculous amounts of money for an answer that cannot be wrong. Actually, once you've got the reputation, then anything you say, all you've got to say is you're off code. Once you've got, it's kind of like professors after a while, no one ever thinks to call a professor. Well, you should always question. I hope I've encouraged you now to reputation should mean nothing. Reputation should mean nothing. Everything should be in what is it that people are saying. And that's actually, in one sense, some people could say is one of the tragedies of advertising, one of the tragedies of what we have done in terms of creative work, in terms of what we've taken the most creative, the best people in the society, the most intellectual people, and instead of having them working on really important stuff that may be actually important to the society, we have them working on how to sell hummus, how to sell cheese, how to sell pimple cream, how to sell beer. That becomes, and that is, I mean, in that sense, creativity is a zero-sum game. If people are working on this, they're not working on something else. And so it's not just we're talking about advertising, we're also talking about a world we're talking about questions that have not been asked. And especially we're talking about questions that have not even been attempted to be answered by people, in fact, who may be the most qualified to teach them, or most qualified to try and answer them. There is, as I said, there's a huge, billions of dollars spent over the years, and even today, on this kind of on this attempt to make scientific what actually is not particularly scientific. So that's the third stage. The fourth stage is what we can call the stage of market segmentation, and lasts from about the 1950s through to the present time. In this stage, there is a focus from and it's not a shift, as you can say. There's an additional viewpoint that's added. That is, there's a shift from the focus on the consumer to a focus on the market. New research showed that you couldn't just talk about people in a general way anymore. That in fact people actually were very complicated. In fact, people were very, very different. And if you really wanted to be effective with people, you have to understand those differences. You have to understand those distinctions. That is, there are subgroupings within the mass audience. And the move now, the additional move now is from a general appeal to a specific appeal. Let's go to quote number 4. This is talking about market segmentation. This is Daniel Pope again. He says, marketing theorist Wendell R. Smith, in an influential 1956 article, defined the corporate response to demand diversity as market segmentation. And the phrase has become a staple in the profession's literature. Stop there. Right? The response to demand diversity. That is, people want things for different reasons. Right? That's a diversity. People don't want people want different kinds of things for different kinds of reasons. And that's what he means by demand diversity. And the phrase has become a staple in the profession's literature. Segmentation, Smith stated, consists of viewing a heterogeneous market characterized by divergent demand as a number of smaller homogeneous markets in response to differing product preferences among important market segments. Right? Stop there, so that's a mouthful right there. That is, he says, consists of viewing a heterogeneous market. Okay, hetero means many. So a market that is characterized by different kinds of demand. And instead of thinking about it, oh, this is all different, think about it instead of one market, think about them all as separate markets. Instead of thinking about one market that works differently, think about them, in fact, as separate markets that in their own way work similarly. So if you can find the way, you can find how you can group together these consumers who buy for this reason, you can group these consumers that buy for that reason, then you can actually think about them as different markets. They are different segments of the same market. And you can treat them in that way. He goes on. Smith contrasts his segmentation strategies in marketing with attempts at product differentiation. In the latter, so product differentiation is, that product differentiation means, here is how my product is better than that one. Here is my product is different than that one. That's what product, so it's focused on the product. That's what product differentiation means. And he says, so he contrasts segmentation strategy in marketing with attempts at product differentiation. In the latter case, a seller would claim to have something extra or better which made his brand preferable for all buyers. Too often, however, an appeal to everyone turned out to be an appeal to nobody in particular, or even nobody at all. Better, therefore, to divide up the broader market and design a campaign that could reach and attract a specific target audience with distinctive needs or desires. One review of the concept called segmentation, the most influential marketing concept of the 20th century. Instead of one market, in fact, you have many different markets within that. And if you can segment them out, and then you can appeal to that segment in a different way. Let's go to quote number, I've got 3 quotes actually on this. Quote number 5, this is from Stephen Klein. They're talking about this. He says, to the contemporary advertiser, the marketplace is viewed not as a personality type, but as a demographic substratum organized around particular measurable behavioral practices, lifestyles, consumption styles, media use, brand purchases, etc. In one sense, this is in important ways a kind of reaction against motivational research. That is actually, no, what's important is not what we share together. It's not the unconscious that we all share together. It's not, as Rapé says, the reptilian mind. But in fact, is how we are different from each other in terms of our consumption, different from each other in terms of how we relate to goods. And that actually is what we should focus on. And then quote number 6, this is from a marketing textbook, talking about this again, market segmentation. That mission is to produce communication campaigns in marketing that get to the right people with the right message at the right time. Right? That's a very succinct way of talking about market segmentation. Produce communication campaigns, produce ads that get to the right people with the right message at the right time. That is, you could get to the wrong people with a message. So you've got to actually identify. You've got to find that what it is. Within the mass market. Okay, within the mass market, you've got to find those sub-markets that operate in a similar way. And if you can do that, then if you want to sell Pepsi, and you know that 20-year-old women act differently and have different motivations than 50-year-old men, well, then you don't actually appeal to them in the same way. What you do is you appeal to them in different ways. You have a marketing strategy for an advertising campaign for the 20-year-old female, and you have another one for the 50-year-old male. Even though you're still selling Coke, but you're selling it in different ways. And again, that if you look at the modern, that has been helped in the in contemporary times by media, of course, that can deliver that segmented audience. So you actually have media now. You have, especially with cable, you have the ability, in fact, to reach very particular kinds of audiences. So you don't actually just have to say, well, we're going to buy time on NBC, and we know that actually part of our audience is there, and we're going to try and reach them by hitting that. And we don't, I know that 80% of my audience, 80% of the people watching this are not going to, that they're not going to be receptive to the ad, but it's not meant for them. Instead of thinking of that broad-shot way of advertising, you say, actually, well, instead of advertising on NBC, can I advertise on Lifetime and because I know Lifetime is actually much more connected to the audience for Lifetime is largely female. Or if I want to hit males, young males, do I advertise on Spike? If I want to hit kids, do I advertise on Nickelodeon? So that there are now, the media, in fact, has responded to this need for market segmentation by providing audiences and providing access to audiences that in fact are that specific. So these are the four, in terms of how the agencies think, how advertising thinks about the audience, right? First starts off with, well, they're kind of rational. They want to know, you have to give them reasons why you should buy this. You should give them lots of information about the product. To secondly, well, actually, people actually also operate, irrationally as well, and you can appeal to emotions, you can appeal to feelings, you can appeal to the third stage. Actually, people are, they also operate according to the unconscious. And so if you can reach down to that reptilian part, that's what, when Rapay talks about reptilian, he's talking about, it's a fancy name, when you're charging someone $100,000 to listen to you speak for a weekend, you have to come up with fancy words to describe what is actually quite ordinary. Okay, but that's the unconscious. Can we tap into those unconscious things that are going on in people's minds? And then this last stage, which is actually instead of targeting everyone, what we should do is we should really focus in on who we know our consumers are, and if they're different, then we need to reach them in different ways in the most effective way. That is, you can't through market segmentation. So those are four stages, and again, I want you to think about them, and you'll see why I want you to think about them cumulatively, but think about them historically and, as well as develops over time. Now, and we should be, actually, this is the question. If what we're looking at is relevant, we should be able to see those changes. We should be able to see those different conceptions of the audience, those different understandings of how people operate. We should be able to see them in ads. We should be able to pinpoint, we should be able to look at patterns of advertising and say, look, there is something new happening here. This is when something new starts to happen in the marketplace as a response to how advertisers are thinking about the audience. And again, next time we'll hopefully attempt to do that. Now, at the same time as that is going on, okay, on the one hand, advertisers are thinking differently about audiences. But if you look at that relationship that advertisers stand between media and business, well, the needs of business change, and so advertising has to respond to that, i.e. branding becomes much more important, so advertising responds to that. In fact, in the 1980s, what businesses need in the 1980s is global campaigns. So businesses actually now start to think of themselves not just, I want to operate now not just in the United States, I want to operate a similar kind of campaign everywhere in the world. Well, if that's what business wants, then actually advertising changes to reflect that. And then, in fact, the structure of advertising changes to reflect what businesses need. So advertisers are always responding to the two sides of that relationship. And if you want to, again, if you want to understand, advertising doesn't work on its own. Right? Advertising can't be understood on its own. It can only be understood as part of a relationship, as part of a complex set of relationships. And if you want to understand what advertising is doing, then by definition, you've got to understand the broader set of relationships. You've got to understand what's going on with business. You've got to understand what's going on with clients. You've got to understand what's going on with the audience. You've got to understand what's going on with media. And then you're going to figure out, okay, how does all this relate to, how do the media then, how do the advertising agencies take this in and then create something? Because they can't just take it in and kind of, they're not like Rapay. They actually have to produce an ad at some point. They actually have to do something out of this that actually has to operate in the marketplace, and that has to be effective in whatever way effectiveness is defined. And that's always a little bit unclear. So there are also, let's look on the other side. There are also changes in media. It's not just the media is set. What happens on that side of the equation also is important. For example, there is the relationship that advertising mediates is not just one media. It starts off, of course, with newspapers. Okay, the first media is newspapers, and so what's emphasized is print. What's emphasized is the rational quality of text, of writing, etc. So in one sense, advertising is limited by the delivery system that it has. Even if you had some advertisers you thought in really creative ways about illustrations and about trying to get to the unconscious in the 1890s, they didn't have there wasn't a media that was capable of delivering that kind of message. So you're limited also by the message. The second thing that develops is magazines. Okay, now there are new technologies of illustration. There is photography, there is color, It forces the agencies to explore new communication forms. Again, that's added. Now the magazines can offer, you can offer full-page color ads. Well, now the potential for how you can think about communication also expands at that same time. The third medium that is introduced is radio. Now, actually, radio, when it first develops, again, it's one of those interesting little things. Radio, when it first develops, is not based on advertising. The very first radio stations, in fact, there's no advertising on the first radio stations. And in fact, in Europe, it remains that way. In Europe, radio is connected to a government monopoly, and a lot of the radio stations remain public. Whereas in the United States, what happens is they quickly get taken in. They quickly become funded by advertising. And so they become essentially delivery systems for advertising. And the agencies then, adapt to this new medium. In fact, one of the most important things the agencies do, the functions they take on, the advertising agencies actually not only make the ads, but they also, in fact, make the programs on radio in those early years. They're actually producers. So, in fact, when an advertising agency would buy an hour block, and they would make the programming within that, as well as make the ads that would appear within it. And so, as a result, I mean, the agencies, they hired talent, they wrote scripts, they produced shows, and as a result, they learn about radio. They learn about radio, not just about selling, but they learn about the medium in that sense. Let's go to quote number 7. This is Lisa Tall talking about this, talking about radio and how it changes. They say, people could not listen to selling messages all day. So the agencies began to explore styles of communication, the communication preferences of the audience, and the production values that would hold them and draw them. Music, humor, stars, pathos, tragedy, excitement, and human relationships became familiar terrain for the advertising agency and opened up new ideas about how to improve advertising. Like all those things, music, humor, stars, pathos, tragedy, excitement. Okay, that is what's in the programming. That's what's in the program. That's the programs that they're making so that people will listen. And the agencies learn through that. The agencies learn about communication because of what they're doing. And they take what they learn about the medium of radio and they then apply it to advertising as well. So the advertising agency is not passive. Like it connects, it makes connections between business and media, but it does so in an active way. It is not passive. They learn. In this instance, they learn from being producers of radio programs. For example, in the period between the wars, we start to see the rise of what is called testimonial advertising, where people come and they testify, they stand for the product. They say, you should buy this product because I use this product. And that is only possible if there are people who are famous, if there are people who have reputation, so that they can translate that reputation onto the product. Well, that's not possible until there's a star system that develops with radio. It's not possible until, in fact, the movies develop and there's a star system with the movies as well. So again, it's dependent upon the other things the other things going on. But the movies, although the movies don't make their way directly into the advertising system, but influences from the movies find their way into advertising. And so, because again, between the wars, when radio is developing, in fact, movies are the major medium of popular culture in the society. And that is what people are watching. But influences from the movies also start to make their way into advertising. So there's much more focus on narrative. There's much more focus on telling a story. Because again, before, when you only have print, it's difficult to tell a story in one page. You can do it. But when you have 30 seconds or 60 seconds to fill out, and you now know that people are used to watching stories. They're used to watching, 20-minute stories, 30-minute stories in the movies. Well, then you can start to think about using narrative as well. Narrative as well as a way to sell your product. Then comes television. Okay, that's the fourth one. Television is added directly to the mix. Television is best at simulating interpersonal communication. There's a focus on people, on interpersonal interactions. Testimonials become even more important in this phase. The mini drama becomes important, where there's a little story that's played out in 30 seconds. You can also now, because television makes possible visual demonstration, you can actually visually demonstrate what the product can do. You can have little vignettes about the product fitting into certain kinds of social scenes. This is Lisa Tall summing it up. They say about this, they say products have been woven into a broad range of simulated and fictional settings since the turn of this century. But television simply could do everything so much better. Magazines displayed goods amid Doric columns or Greek statues, thus positioning them within an associational matrix of images and styles. Radio opened up dialogue and social interaction as context within which appeals were made. Television swept all earlier forms into its orbit and added others, ultimately offering the whole range of cultural reference systems to advertisers as aids in selling their wares. Okay, all those things, let's come back to this. Okay, that's the relationship, right? You're going to get fed up with me talking about this, right? That's the key relationship. So you can look at how, on the one hand, in a general way, but then you add to it, you can start to make it more complicated. You can start to, not just more complicated, you can start to make it more concrete. You can start to make it more relevant as to what's going on. For example, from the viewpoint of advertising agents, how they think about the audience, you got that. Okay, they think about the audience, rationality, irrationality, motivational research, market segmentation. They're changing the way they're thinking about the audience. At the same time, the media is also changing. You've got newspapers, you've got magazines, you've got radio, you've got television. So think about this as a dynamic relationship. It's not just built and stays the same. This actually is a dynamic relationship that is added to. And if we want to understand what is going on, if we want to understand why the advertising we see looks like it does, okay, you've got to pull back the curtain, like it's the Wizard of Oz. You've got to pull back the curtain to see the wizard behind, to see what's going on behind the curtain in terms of the levers that are being pulled. Well, this is not so much levers. I'm not talking here about manipulation. I'm talking about pulling back the curtain sociologically, pulling back the curtain culturally, pulling back the curtain economically, so that we can see what it is that propels this system of advertising. As I said, if we want to understand what's going on in advertising in the contemporary period, well, what's changed? Well, the internet has changed. The internet is added to this now. Okay, what role then does the internet play within, and especially as the internet now is drawing more and more advertising? How then does that change how advertisers are starting to think about the audience? And also, how do advertisers think about young audiences? Do they have a different way of thinking about people who've grown up on television for this entire time, who have grown up within a system of pop culture, who may be cynical about pop culture, who may be resistant, they don't want to be exposed to advertising? If you add that as well, that gives you, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. That's the contemporary context, in which changes in media, changes in audiences now the question I want to pose actually is, the question is, can you then see this? Can you look at advertising? Can you look at those ads? Can you look at what is the products of this industry and see those patterns as we've examined them in the last two classes? That's what we'll look at next time.